17 earthquakes in one night. That is what the ground beneath one small California farm town produced in the first hour after midnight. A magnitude 3.6, a 3.4, a 3.1, and a crowd of smaller shocks arriving one after another, with no main event and no sign of a schedule. On their own, earthquakes that size barely make the local news. This cluster is different because of where it sits. The Brawley Seismic Zone, the restless patch of crust wired directly into the southern end of the San Andreas Fault, a fault that has been storing energy in total silence for more than 300 years. The last time a swarm lit up near that fault's doorstep, the United States government publicly raised the odds of the big one. So what does this one mean? One thing before we get into it. If you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next debrief, and leave a comment with where you're tuning in from tonight. Now let's break this down. Part 1. 17 Earthquakes Before Sunrise. At 14 minutes past midnight on July 23, 2026, the ground beneath Imperial County, California started moving, and then it did not stop. The first event was a magnitude 3.1 centered about 7 kilometers south of the city of Brawley, at a depth of roughly 10.5 kilometers. On its own, that earthquake would barely rate a mention. Southern California produces small earthquakes the way the rest of us produce laundry. But 17 minutes later, at 12:31 in the morning, a magnitude 3.6 broke at essentially the same spot, about 11 kilometers down, and in between those two, and after them, and stacked around them through the small hours of the morning came more. Monitoring reports circulating overnight counted 17, then 18 earthquakes within roughly the first hour, most of them between magnitude 1.6 and 2.8, several of them above magnitude 3, arriving in an irregular, stuttering rhythm that woke up anyone in the Imperial Valley who keeps earthquake alerts on their phone. Which in this part of California is a lot of people. By the time the sun came up over the farmland, a magnitude 3.4 had joined the list at 1:49 in the morning, and the picture was unmistakable. This was not one earthquake with trailing aftershocks. This was a swarm, a crowd of earthquakes with no leader, and it was happening in a very specific piece of real estate called the Brawley Seismic Zone. 36 people filed reports with the United States Geological Survey's Did You Feel It system for the magnitude 3.6 alone. The reports clustered in Brawley itself, a farming city of about 29,000 people, and stretched out to Holtville, 22 kilometers away, and Heber, 20 kilometers away. Nobody was hurt. Nothing fell. As of that morning, there was no damage to report at all. Just a valley full of people lying awake, feeling the floor tremble every few minutes, wondering what the ground was trying to say. So let's answer the question in this video's title right away, because you deserve a straight answer before we go anywhere else. Why does a pile of magnitude 3s have locals on high alert? 2 reasons. The first is that this exact patch of ground did this exact thing 11 weeks ago. In May, this same zone produced more than 300 earthquakes in a single swarm, and the biggest of them was strong enough to wake people in San Diego, more than 100 kilometers away. What started overnight is not a new event. It is a restart, and swarms that stop and restart are swarms whose engine is still running. The second reason is geography, and it is the reason this channel is spending 2 hours on it. The Brawley Seismic Zone is not just any noisy patch of desert. It is the connector, the piece of crust that links the Imperial Fault, which runs up from the Mexican border to the southern end of the most famous fault on Earth. Follow the swarm northward, past the town of Westmoreland, past the geothermal plants, along the southern shore of the Salton Sea, and you arrive at a place called Bombay Beach. And at Bombay Beach, rising out of the desert like a buried blade, begins the San Andreas Fault. The southernmost section of the San Andreas has not ruptured in a major earthquake in at least 300 years. It is, by most measures, the most heavily loaded stretch of fault in California, sitting closer to its breaking point than any other, and it has been perfectly unnervingly silent for centuries. The Brawley Seismic Zone is the doorstep of that silence. When the doorstep trembles, the people who study this system for a living do not panic, but they do look up. There is an official government protocol, a real one, used within the last decade, for calculating how much a swarm in this zone raises the odds of the San Andreas going. We are going to walk through that protocol, and the 1 week in 2016 when the number it produced was alarming enough that the state of California issued a public advisory. That is where we're going tonight. What happened in the dark on July 23rd? what this zone is and why it swarms when almost nothing else in California does, what happened in May and what it tells us about this restart, and the question underneath all of it, the one the alert level is really about, not whether these small earthquakes can hurt anyone, they almost certainly cannot, but whether the noisiest piece of crust in the state can wake up the quietest, deadliest fault next door. It is worth pausing on what those felt reports actually represent, because the Did You Feel It system is one of the quiet marvels of modern seismology, and it will be one of our main windows into this swarm as it develops. When an earthquake happens anywhere in the United States, the Geological Survey's automated systems post it within minutes, and ordinary people who felt it can log on and answer a short questionnaire. Where were you? What did you feel? Did objects rattle? Did anything fall? Each response is converted into a point on an intensity map, and together the points draw a picture no instrument network could draw alone, the actual human footprint of the shaking. For last night's magnitude 3.6, that footprint was a tight oval over the central Imperial Valley. 36 responses, concentrated in Brawley, thinning out through Holtville and Heber, gone before the mountains. That is exactly the footprint a magnitude 3.6 at 11 kilometers depth should produce, noticeable indoors near the epicenter, a gentle shudder at 20 kilometers, imperceptible beyond 50. Nothing about the individual events of last night was unusual. It was the plural that made the night remarkable, and the plural is what the valley's residents were responding to. A single magnitude 3 wakes you once. You check your phone, see the notification, and go back to sleep. 17 in an hour is a different experience entirely, a night where the floor never quite finishes settling, where each new shudder resets the question of whether the next one will be bigger, where the phone lights up again before you have put it down. People in Brawley have lived through this before, some of them several times now, and that experience is precisely why the alert level rises so fast here. The valley has learned that these nights are openings, not conclusions. What no one can know from inside a trembling house is which kind of opening, and that is the question the rest of this video is built to answer as honestly as the science allows. A word, too, about how the numbers you are hearing get made, because they will be revised as this sequence develops, and the revisions are part of the story. When an earthquake strikes Southern California, the first magnitude and location you see are automatic, computed by algorithms within tens of seconds from the regional network, good enough for alerts, rough around the edges. Within minutes to hours, duty seismologists review the waveforms by hand. They repick the wave arrivals, refine the depth, sometimes nudge the magnitude a tenth or two in either direction. The figures we're using tonight, 3.1 at 10.5 kilometers, 3.6 at 11, are that second kind, reviewed solutions, and they may still sharpen further as more analysis lands. This matters for a swarm especially, because swarm catalogues grow retroactively. Many of the smallest events are only identified later. When analysts comb the continuous recordings for ruptures, the automatic systems missed under the noise of their bigger siblings. May's count of 300 was not reached in real time. It was assembled over days. Whatever count tonight's restart eventually earns, expect it to be higher than the number anyone quotes this morning, and treat any suspiciously precise early figure, including the 17 in this video's thumbnail, as what it honestly is. The opening tally from the first hour of monitoring, with the ledger still open. Southern Californians also now experience nights like this through a layer of technology that did not exist a decade ago, and it changes the texture of a swarm. The state's earthquake early warning system, delivered through phone apps and the wireless alert network, watches the first instance of every substantial rupture and races a warning ahead of the shaking. For small swarm events it stays silent. Magnitude 3s fall below its thresholds, but residents with the apps installed watch the notifications accumulate in real time, each one time-stamped, located and mapped within a minute or two of the shaking. A swarm in 2026 is therefore a public event in a way no previous generation of Imperial Valley residents experienced. Everyone in the county can watch the sequence assemble itself, event by event, on the same feeds the scientists use. That transparency is mostly a gift. It is also, as we'll see when we reach the viral claims later in this video, a fire hose that pattern-hungry minds can drink from a little too eagerly. Because here is the detail from last night that matters more than the count of 17. It is where, in the depth of the crust, the biggest of these earthquakes are coming from, and to understand why that detail made me sit up, you first need to understand what a swarm actually is, and why it breaks the one rule that almost every earthquake sequence on this planet obeys. Part 2. The crowd with no leader. Almost every earthquake sequence you have ever heard about follows the same script. There is a main shock, the big one, the event that gets the magnitude in the headline. Before it, sometimes, a few foreshocks that nobody recognizes as foreshocks until later. After it, a long tail of aftershocks that start strong and fade, each day quieter than the last, following a decay curve so reliable that seismologists have had a mathematical law for it since the 1890s. Energy in, energy out, order restored. When we covered the Mexico earthquake and its aftershocks last week, that decay curve was the whole story. The question was simply whether the sequence was fading on schedule, a swarm tiers that script up. In a swarm there is no main shock. There is no single event that towers over the rest and explains them. Instead, you get a crowd of earthquakes of roughly similar size, several of them close to the largest, arriving in fits and starts, speeding up, slowing down, wandering from one patch of the fault to another. The rate rises when it should fall. It falls when nothing says it should. A swarm can run for hours, days, or weeks. It can stop dead, absolutely silent for 11 weeks. And then, at 14 minutes past midnight on a Thursday in late July, it can clear its throat and start again. The reason swarms behave this way is that they are not driven by the same thing as normal earthquake sequences. An aftershock sequence is the crust rebalancing itself after one large rupture. The main shock changes the stress on everything around it, and the neighbourhood adjusts loudly at first, then more quietly, until the books are balanced. A swarm is driven by something else moving through the rock. In most cases, the something is fluid. Water, brine, gas, or in volcanic settings, magma, working its way through networks of cracks, prying faults open from the inside, lowering the friction that holds them still. The earthquakes are not the crust adjusting to one big break. They are the crust reacting patch by patch to something migrating through its plumbing. That is why swarms ignore the decay law. The forcing does not fade on a schedule, it moves, and this is why, if you want to be precise about what has locals on alert, the number 17 is almost beside the point. 17 small earthquakes in an hour is loud, but the loudness is not the message. The message is the pattern, no leader, irregular rhythm. Several events bunch near the top of the range, 10 and 11 kilometers down. A restart of a structure that already proved in May that it can produce 300 of these and climb into the magnitude 4 range before losing interest. Every one of those features says fluid-driven swarm, and a fluid-driven swarm at the foot of the San Andreas is a different kind of object than a random magnitude 3.6 would be. You might reasonably ask how anyone can be sure, hours into a sequence, that this is a swarm and not the foreshocks of something larger. The honest answer, the one this channel owes you, is that nobody can be sure, and nobody serious claims to be. Foreshocks are only ever identified in the rearview mirror. Roughly 5 to 10% of moderate earthquakes turn out, retrospectively, to have been the warm-up act for something bigger. In our video on the earthquake off Vancouver Island a few days ago, we put the number at about 6%, the worldwide odds that any given moderate quake is followed within 3 days by something larger. Those odds apply here too, tonight, to every event in this swarm. About 1 chance in 16, refreshed with each new earthquake, not 0, not large, a number you live with, the way everyone in this valley has learned to. But here is what tips the odds in the reassuring direction, and it comes straight from the seismometers. When the May swarm was running, researchers pulled up the recording from a station near the swarm and looked at the 2 hours on either side of its largest event. In a main shock-aftershock sequence, that picture has a shape. Quiet, then the spike, then a thinning forest of aftershocks decaying away. The Brawley picture had no shape at all. Events of scattered sizes before and after the biggest one, with no decay in either direction, a wall of static, not a bell in its fading ring. That is the fingerprint of a swarm, and last night's activity is drawing the same picture on the same instruments. The decay law that swarms break has a name and a history worth 30 seconds of your time, because it defines the normal that Brawley is violating. In 1894, the Japanese seismologist Fusakichi Omori, studying the aftershocks of a great earthquake that had struck central Japan 3 years earlier, noticed that the rate of aftershocks fell off in a remarkably regular way. roughly in proportion to 1 divided by the time since the main shock. Twice as many days since the main shock, roughly half the daily aftershocks. His formula, refined but not fundamentally changed in the 130 years since, remains one of the most reliable empirical laws in all of Earth science. It is the reason seismologists can publish aftershock forecasts within hours of a major earthquake. The reason that, after the Mexico event we covered last week, agencies could state with confidence how the sequence should thin out week by week. Omori's law is the metronome of normal seismicity. When a sequence follows it, the physics is understood. 1 rupture, 1 stress change, 1 long relaxation. Plot the Brawley events of last night against Omori's curve, and there is simply no fit to attempt. The rate rose, dipped, rose again. The largest event arrived 17 minutes into the sequence, not at its start. Events of similar size scattered across the whole window, rather than shrinking away from a peak. A statistician handed this catalogue blind would say, whatever is driving this, it is not relaxing. It is being continuously forced. And that phrase, continuously forced, is the technical core of everything unsettling about a swarm. The forcing is invisible, its reservoir is unknown, its schedule is unknowable from the surface. Seismologists studying swarms around the world have watched them migrate at speeds consistent with pressurized fluid diffusing through fractured rock, a front of pressure moving through the basement, switching faults on as it arrives, switching them off as it passes. The earthquakes are not the phenomenon, they are the footprints of the phenomenon, and we only ever see the footprints. There is one more piece of context that regular viewers will find familiar, because it has appeared in nearly every earthquake video this channel has made: the base rates of escalation. Any moderate earthquake anywhere carries roughly a 6% chance of being followed within 3 days by something larger, a number that holds surprisingly steady across magnitudes and regions. Around 5 to 10% of moderate events are eventually reclassified, in hindsight, as foreshocks. The most sobering illustration remains the Great Japan earthquake of March 2011, which was preceded 2 days earlier by a magnitude 7.3 that the entire global seismological community logged, at the time, as an ordinary large earthquake. Nobody flagged it, because there was nothing to flag. Foreshocks carry no signature, no special frequency content, no tell. They are ordinary earthquakes that happen to have an extraordinary sequel. Every event in the Brawley swarm carries that same 6% shadow, renewed with each new rupture. The shadow is small. It is also permanent, and it is why no responsible scientist will ever tell you a swarm is definitely just a swarm while it is still running. Swarms also scramble the intuitions people carry about aftershocks in a way worth making explicit, because it changes how to read the coming days. After a normal main shock, the forecast logic is subtraction. Each passing quiet day genuinely lowers the odds of further trouble, because the sequence is a relaxation, and relaxations run down. During a swarm, quiet days subtract nothing reliable. The May sequence produced its largest event after a day of build-up. Other swarms worldwide have produced theirs in week 2, or after a lull that looked like the end. As long as the driving pressure persists, the sequence's probability clock does not run down. It merely idles between episodes. This is why you will not hear the professionals declare this swarm over at any point in the coming days, no matter how quiet it gets. The only verdict a swarm permits is the retrospective one. The same verdict may eventually earned. It has been quiet for weeks, and so, apparently it was done. Until then, the working assumption stays the same. The engine is on until proven otherwise, and 11 weeks of silence has already proven once exactly how little silence proves. So the crowd has no leader, and the crowd is back. The obvious next question is what, exactly, it is a crowd of. What is physically down there, cracking, 10 kilometres under the lettuce fields and the feedlots south of Brawley? The answer involves a fault that does not appear on the surface, does not run the direction any casual observer would guess, and was mapped almost entirely by the earthquakes themselves, 11 weeks ago, when this same structure introduced itself to the entire valley in the middle of the night. Part 3. The May Rehearsal. On the afternoon of May 9th, 2026, an earthquake happened under Brawley that no human being felt. Magnitude 1.6, about 5 miles down, the seismic equivalent of a whisper in another room. It was the result of roughly 1 millimetre of slip on a fault patch perhaps 100 metres wide. A rounding error, a nothing. Instruments logged it and nobody's coffee rippled. Within hours, the nothing had company. Small events began scattering across the same patch of crust, and at 14 minutes past 4 that afternoon, a magnitude 3.5 snapped off, almost 1,000 times more powerful than the whisper that opened the show, representing about a centimetre of slip on a fault a kilometre long. 21 people reported feeling it, all within about 30 kilometres. The evening filled up with earthquakes, dozens above magnitude 2, more than 20 above magnitude 3. The rhythm was the swarm rhythm, irregular, leaderless, relentless. And then, 10 minutes past midnight on May 10th, a timestamp almost identical, note, to the one that opened last night's restart, the sequence produced its masterpiece, a magnitude 4.7, the largest event of the swarm, strong enough to wake sleepers across the Imperial Valley and rattle windows far beyond it. 161 people felt reports, and the reports reached all the way to San Diego on the far side of the mountains, more than 100 kilometers from the epicenter. One Brawley resident told a news agency, in a quote that does a better job than any seismology lecture, "They just kept on coming and coming and coming and coming, and as we're speaking right now, I do feel it rumbling beneath me." By the time the May swarm wound down, the United States Geological Survey had catalogued more than 300 earthquakes. Regular viewers may remember it. We covered that swarm as it happened in our videos from May 10th and 11th, back when the question of the hour was identical to tonight's. The swarm faded the way swarms usually do, not with a finale, just with lengthening silences until the silences won. 11 weeks of quiet followed. If you lived in Brawley, you could be forgiven for filing the whole episode away as a bad week, over and done. Except swarms do not really end. They pause. The fluid that drives them does not evaporate. The pressures that move it do not resolve on any schedule we can see from the surface. One of the best documented traits of earthquake swarms worldwide is exactly this stop and restart behavior. Activity ceasing abruptly, sometimes for weeks or months, then resuming on the same structure as if no time had passed. Seismologists watching a swarm die down will tell you carefully that they cannot distinguish a swarm that has finished from a swarm that's holding its breath. The only way to find out is to wait. The Imperial Valley waited 11 weeks. Last night the answer arrived, holding its breath. And when you plot last night's epicenters against May's, they land on the same buried structure, which is itself the third occupant of that address. The May swarm's footprint coincides, almost exactly, with a smaller swarm that ran in late 2016 and early 2017. Same patch, same orientation, a decade apart. 3 separate generations of earthquakes have now used this one hidden fault as their stage. Whatever plumbing feeds it is not a one-time arrangement. It is a permanent feature of the basement under Brawley, and it has a habit of reopening. The energy arithmetic of the May sequence deserves a moment, because it illustrates a property of the magnitude scale that even earthquake country residents routinely underestimate. The scale is logarithmic. Each whole step up represents about 32 times more energy released. The gap from the opening magnitude 1.6 to the closing 4.7 spans 3.1 magnitude units, which works out to roughly 40,000 times more energy. The whisper and the masterpiece were events of utterly different physical scale, produced by the same structure in the same week. When seismologists say a swarm is exploring its host fault, this is what they mean. The sequence samples patch after patch, size after size, and nothing about the small events constrains what the large ones may do. May's swarm demonstrated a dynamic range of 40,000 to 1. The structure has not shown us its limits, only its repertoire so far. The restart behavior too has precedents beyond this valley that are worth knowing, because they calibrate how little an 11-week silence means. Swarms in volcanic and geothermal regions worldwide, Iceland, Japan, the volcanic fields of the American West, routinely pause for weeks or months and resume on the same structures, sometimes cycling through multiple dormancy periods across a year or more. Closer to home, other California swarms have made the same move, sequences that sputtered out, sat quiet long enough for local news to move on, then returned with their largest events yet. Seismologists describe such systems as episodic rather than finished, the distinction being that an episodic system retains its driving pressure between episodes. 11 quiet weeks at Brawley tell us nothing about the reservoir. They tell us only that the pathway was temporarily shut. Last night something reopened it. The third act is now running on a stage that has hosted this performance, by our best count, since at least 2016, and quite possibly at depths and dates beyond the instrumental record for centuries before that. It is also worth tallying what the May swarm did not do, because the negative space defines the baseline tonight's restart will be measured against. 300 earthquakes and not one injury. A magnitude 4.7 directly beneath a city, and no structural damage worth the name. Some rattled nerves, some items off shelves, nothing red-tagged. No surface rupture, the sediment lid held, as it has through every swarm of the instrumental era. No detectable response from the neighbouring faults. The Imperial Fault stayed quiet, the San Andreas stayed quiet, the regional networks showed no uptick beyond the swarm's own footprint, and no forecast-level escalation. The sequence never tripped the thresholds that would have obliged the Geological Survey to publish odds, the way earlier swarms had. By every operational measure, May was a complete self-contained, harmless performance, the system demonstrating its full repertoire short of consequence. That is the most likely template for what has just begun. The reason it cannot simply be assumed is the subject of the rest of this video. One more number worth carrying forward. For all its 300 events, the May swarm's entire energy release, summed across every earthquake in the catalogue, amounted to less than a single magnitude 5.0 would deliver in a few seconds. Swarms are loud the way rain on a roof is loud, sustained, attention-holding, and cumulatively modest. The single crack of the 2012 5.5 outweighed May's whole month. Keep that as symmetry in mind whenever the event counts start to impress you, tonight or in the coverage ahead. In seismology, the count is drama, but the magnitude is the money. 17 earthquakes in an hour is a headline. One earthquake at 5.5 is a damage report. The entire art of watching this swarm is keeping one eye on each. That habit is worth dwelling on, because it reframes what happened last night. 17 earthquakes in an hour sounds like an outbreak. It is better understood as a resumption. The third act of a performance that started in 2016, went dark, returned in May, went dark again, and has now returned again, each time with the machinery a little better mapped by the earthquakes it produces. And the map those earthquakes have drawn is genuinely strange. The fault they illuminate runs the wrong way, perpendicular to every major fault in the valley, and the biggest earthquakes it produces come from its deepest, strongest flaw. Both of those details matter enormously for what this swarm can and cannot become, and they are where we go next. Part 4. The fault that runs the wrong way. Every fault map of the Imperial Valley tells the same visual story. The big faults, the Imperial Fault, the San Jacinto system to the west, the San Andreas to the northeast, all run northwest to southeast, roughly paralleling the Pacific coastline, because they are all parts of the same grand machine, the boundary where the Pacific Plate grinds past North America. If you sketched the valley's faults from memory, you would draw a sheaf of long parallel lines, all leaning the same way, like grass combed by wind. The fault under Brawley ignores all of that. When researchers drew cross-sections through the May swarm, slicing the cloud of hypercenters one way then the other, the earthquakes lined up along a structure oriented northeast to southwest, perpendicular to the Imperial Fault, perpendicular to the San Andreas, crosswise to the entire regional grain, like a single blade of grass lying against the comb. The structure is about 6 kilometers long, and the swarm's earthquakes occurred along it at depths from about 2 kilometers down to 15. This sounds like an anomaly, and locally it is, but it is an anomaly with a family. The fault networks of Southern California are dominated by those long coast-parallel strike-slip faults, but between them, especially where the big faults end, step sideways, or hand off their motion to one another, the crust is crossed by smaller perpendicular structures, cross-faults, that take up the awkward geometry the main faults cannot. Work published in Geophysical Research Letters in 2017 by Eagle, Hauckson and colleagues, examining decades of seismicity near the southern terminus of the San Andreas, found that swarm after swarm in this region has run on exactly these orthogonal cross-faults. The 2012 swarm did, the 2016 swarm at this spot did, May's did, and by every early indication, last night's is doing the same. In the Brawley Seismic Zone, the crosswise faults are not the exception. They are the local specialty, the small gears between the big wheels. The second detail from the May cross-sections is the one I flagged at the top of this video, and it deserves your full attention. The largest earthquakes in the May swarm did not come from the shallow part of the fault. They nucleated at its floor, 13 to 16 kilometers down, the deepest events in the entire sequence. The biggest members of the crowd were coming from the bottom of the room. Last night's pattern rhymes with that. The magnitude 3.6, the largest so far, broke at around 11 kilometers, deeper than most of its smaller companions. To see why that matters, you need one piece of rock physics, and it is a piece that puzzled the founders of seismology for decades. Intuition says the shallow crust, being brittle and cold, should host the big ruptures, while the deep crust, warm and squeezed, should be tamer. The opposite is true, and the reason is strength. Laboratory experiments on rock under pressure eventually show that the crust gets stronger with depth, dramatically so, right up until it gets hot enough to flow instead of break. That crossover, the brittle to plastic transition, is the true floor of earthquake country. Just above it, the rock is at its absolute strongest, which means an earthquake that manages to start there starts at the highest possible stress. And a rupture born at high stress has more force available to keep itself going. It is the difference between a fire starting in a damp corner and a fire starting in the driest room of the house. So when a swarm's biggest events come from 13 to 16 kilometers from the strong floor, the swarm is telling you it has access to the crust's high-stakes table. Most of its earthquakes are small, and most will stay small, but the ones that nucleate at the bottom have in principle the most room to grow. That is not a prediction. It is an observation about where this particular machine keeps its heaviest flywheel. Hold on to it, because it will come back when we talk about how big a Brawley swarm has ever gotten, and how big one could get. For scale, keep these energy ratios in your pocket as we go. May's peak, the magnitude 4.7, released roughly 45 times the energy of last night's 3.6. The largest earthquakes any swarm in this zone has ever produced, we will meet them shortly, sit near magnitude 5.5, which is roughly 700 times the 3.6. The staircase between a swarm that rattles windows and a swarm that cracks walls is not many steps long, and the deepest events are the ones standing nearest the stairs. It is worth understanding how a picture like that gets drawn at all, because no one has ever seen this fault and no one ever will. The raw material is arrival times. Every earthquake in the swarm sends out waves, and each seismometer in the regional network. Stations scattered across the valley, the mountains, the shores of the Salton Sea, records the instant those waves arrive. Work backward from enough arrival times, and you can triangulate each earthquake's point of origin in 3 dimensions, its hypercenter, to within a few hundred meters. Plot 300 hypercenters from the May swarm, and they do not scatter randomly through the crust. They condense onto a plane, a thin, tilted sheet of points, 6 kilometers long, running northeast to southwest. That sheet is the fault, not inferred from surface cracks, because there are none. The structure never breaks the surface, buried as it is under kilometers of Colorado River sediment. The earthquakes themselves are the only light anyone has ever shone on it, and each new swarm adds resolution to the photograph, which is one of the genuine scientific silver linings of a night like last night. Every event currently rattling Brawley is also, simultaneously, a data point sharpening the map of the very structure producing it. The dimensions on that map put useful bounds on what the structure can do. A rupture's maximum size is limited by the fault area available to it. A magnitude 4.7 typically ruptures a patch a few kilometers across, which fits comfortably inside a 6 by 13 kilometer plane. A magnitude 5.5, the zone's historical swarm ceiling, needs more real estate, but the mapped structure could plausibly host 1, particularly if a rupture ran the fault's full length. What the structure almost certainly cannot host is anything much beyond that. A magnitude 6 or 7 requires tens to hundreds of kilometers of continuous fault, and this crosswise blade simply is not that long. This is the quiet reassurance hidden in the cross-sections. The swarm's own fault has a built-in ceiling not far above what it has already demonstrated. The catch, of course, is that the swarm's fault is not the only fault in the neighborhood, and the neighborhood is the problem. But within its own 6 kilometers, the machine has a governor. One more feature of the depth story deserves mention. The swarm's earthquakes span nearly the full seismogenic thickness of the local crust, from 2 kilometers down to 15 or 16. In most of California, that span would be unremarkable. Here it is slightly astonishing because the rift has thinned this crust and cooked its lower levels. The brittle to plastic transition sits shallower under the Imperial Valley than almost anywhere in the state. A structure producing earthquakes at 15 kilometers here is working the absolute basement, the last brittle floor above rock too hot to break. The May swarm's biggest events came from that floor. Last night's biggest event came from near it. Whatever is driving this system, it has pressure enough to operate at the crust's strongest, deepest level. And that, more than any single magnitude, is the technical fact that keeps the professionals attentive. There is a practical payoff to the fault's crosswise orientation that will matter if this sequence escalates. It points the structure's strongest shaking in a knowable direction. A rupture radiates energy in a pattern shaped by its orientation and slip direction, and a northeast-southwest fault under Brawley directs its strongest pulses along and off the ends of that trend, which is part of why May's biggest event was felt so distinctly across the valley floor and out towards San Diego, rather than evenly in all directions. Orientation also governs which neighbours a rupture talks to mechanically. A crosswise structure loads and unloads the parallel blades around it differently than another parallel fault would, transferring its small stress changes onto the ends of the Imperial Fault to the south and the fault strands threading toward the Salton Sea in the north. Everything about this buried blade, its length, its depth range, its tilt, its trend, is now well enough mapped that seismologists can model those transfers explicitly, and you can be confident that as of this morning, someone at the regional network is doing precisely that with last night's catalogue, and with that, we have the machine fairly well described. A buried 6-kilometre crossfault, crosswise to the valley, fed by fluids, restarting for its third documented run, throwing its hardest punches from its strongest depths. Described, but not located. Because everything that makes this story more than local news comes from what stands 60 kilometers north of this machine, at the end of a chain of connections that begins at the Mexican border and ends at a rusting seaside ghost town where the most dangerous fault in America rises out of the ground and goes silent. Part 5. The Doorstep of the Sleeping Giant. Start at the border and walk north. Beneath the levees and canals of the Imperial Valley runs the Imperial Fault, the structure that produced the valley's most famous disaster. We will come back to that, and which carries the plate boundary's motion up out of Mexico. Follow the Imperial Fault north, and something odd happens just past Brawley. It simply stops. The fault's northern tip dissolves into a diffuse zone of seismicity, a smear of small earthquake swarms and buried crossfaults occupying the gap between the Imperial Fault's end and the beginning of the next great structure to the north. That smear has a name, the Brawley Seismic Zone. The swarm running right now is sitting just north of the Imperial Fault's tip, in other words precisely inside the connector. Now keep walking. The zone carries you north past Westmoreland, past the southern shore of the Salton Sea, past the steam columns of the geothermal plants on the sea's southeastern edge. And at the northeastern shore, near the improbable little settlement of Bombay Beach, a 1950s resort town half swallowed by salt and time, the ground hands you over to the San Andreas Fault, which begins there and runs northwest for hundreds of miles, through the Coachella Valley, past San Bernardino and the mountain passes above Los Angeles, on toward its long journey up the state. Understand what this geography means mechanically. The Brawley Seismic Zone is not merely near the San Andreas, it is the transfer structure, the coupling in the drivetrain, through which the plate boundary's motion is handed from the Imperial Fault to the San Andreas. The relative motion of the Pacific and North American plates does not pause in the gap. It is transmitted through this zone, through its crossfaults and swarms and hot thin crust, continuously, every year, forever. The swarm you're watching tonight is happening inside the mechanism that loads the southern San Andreas. That is the fact that changes the emotional register of 17 small earthquakes, and it is exactly here that I owe you the honest calibration, because there is a version of this story that overstates the danger and a version that understates it, and both are easy to sell. The overstated version says the swarm is knocking on the San Andreas itself. It is not. The current activity is sitting roughly 60 kilometers south of Bombay Beach and the fault's terminus. Earthquakes this small change the stress on other faults only in their immediate neighbourhood. For magnitude 3s and 4s, that neighbourhood is measured in single kilometers. At 60 kilometers of separation, the direct mechanical influence of last night's events on the San Andreas is, for all practical purposes, 0. The understated version says therefore none of this matters, and that is wrong too, for two reasons. The first is that swarms in this zone migrate. They wander along the plumbing that feeds them, and the plumbing runs north. The scenario that gets seismologists' full attention, the scenario that has gotten it before within the last decade, is a swarm that walks up the zone and lights up at the fault's very doorstep, within a few kilometres of the terminus, where those small stress changes stop being negligible, because the thing they are nudging is a fault believed to be late in its loading cycle and sensitive to persuasion. We will spend an entire part of this video on the week in 2016 when exactly that happened at Bombay Beach, and the United States government did the arithmetic on it in public. The second reason is subtler, and to my mind, heavier. The swarm is a flare going up from inside the loading mechanism itself. It is direct real-time evidence that fluids are moving and stresses are shifting in the very structure whose job is to feed strain into the San Andreas' most dangerous section. Nobody can currently translate that evidence into a forecast, but dismissing it would be like hearing grinding from your car's transmission and taking comfort that the noise is not coming from the engine. The noise is in the part that connects to the engine. That is not comfort. That is the reason you look under the hood. The technical term for what the Brawley Seismic Zone does is worth learning, because it explains both the swarms and the danger in a single concept. It is a step over. The Imperial Fault and the San Andreas are parallel blades, but they are not aligned end to end. They are offset sideways from one another, like two lanes of a road that do not quite meet. The plate motion has to jump from one blade to the other, and the patch of crust where the jump happens gets a very particular kind of abuse. In a step over of this geometry, the jumping motion stretches the crust diagonally, pulling it apart even as it shears it sideways. Stretched crust thins, thinned crust sinks, which is why this stretch of the valley lies below sea level. It also cracks in exactly the crosswise orientation we mapped in Part 4, and it lets heat and fluid rise from below, which by now you can recognise as the complete recipe for everything this zone is. The subsidence, the buried crossfaults, the hot brines, the swarms. One geometric fact, two great faults, offset, generates the entire local phenomenon. Bombay Beach itself, where the handoff completes, is worth a moment of scene setting, because the physical place carries a strange poetry that the maps flatten. It was built in the 1950s as a resort on the New Sea's shore, water skiing, yacht clubs, Sinatra-era optimism. Then the sea began its long retreat and salt and agricultural runoff did the rest. And today Bombay Beach is a half-abandoned grid of trailers and art installations, elevation 223 feet below sea level, where a few hundred residents live at the exact coordinates where the most dangerous fault in America rises out of the ground. Seismologists know the place for a different reason. The fault's terminus there is where several of the region's probabilistic nightmares begin. In the standard rupture scenarios, the ones emergency planners actually exercise against, a great southern San Andreas earthquake nucleates at or near the Bombay Beach terminus and unzips northwest, driving the rupture front and its full budget of accumulated energy up the fault toward the Coachella Valley, San Bernardino, and the passes into the Los Angeles basin. The doorstep where tonight's swarm zone delivers its motion is, in the scenarios, the ignition point. That is not a coincidence of storytelling. Ruptures often start where faults end, because terminations are where stress concentrates, and this particular termination has been collecting stress via the transfer zone now swarming for 300 years. Geologists have a name for the kind of basin this arrangement builds, a pull-apart. Wherever two parallel strike-slip faults hand motion across a gap of this geometry, the crust between them stretches, drops, and forms a sunken block, and the Salton Trough is one of the type examples on Earth, cited in textbooks alongside the Dead Sea, which sits in an almost identical structural pocket between strands of its own transformed boundary. The comparison is worth a beat. The Dead Sea, like the Salton Sink, lies far below sea level. Like the Imperial Valley, it is floored with kilometres of sediment, and like the Brawley Zone, its basin swarms with small earthquakes while the great faults flanking it store their energy for rare historic ruptures. When you see the Imperial Valley this way, as North America's Dead Sea, a below-sea level pull-apart pinched between loaded blades, the whole geography stops being a quirk and becomes a recognizable planetary pattern, with a known behavior and a known failure mode. The speeds involved deserve numbers, because they are the budget behind everything tonight. The Pacific and North American plates slide past each other along this stretch of the boundary at roughly 5 centimeters per year in total, about the pace fingernails grow. That motion is divided among the region's faults. The San Andreas proper carries the largest single share along the Coachella section, with the San Jacinto system and others taking up the remainder. 5 centimeters per year sounds gentle until you multiply it across the silence we keep returning to. 300 years of accumulation at even a partial share of that rate stacks up to on the order of 7 or 8 meters of unspent motion across the boundary's faults, several meters of it charged to the San Andreas account specifically. That is the physical meaning of overdue, not a schedule missed but a debt compounding, centimeter by centimeter, every year the silence holds, with the Brawley Seismic Zone as the teller's window through which the deposits keep arriving. And the buffer between the swarm and the terminus is not empty crust. It is occupied territory, and its occupants are part of tonight's watch. Between Brawley and Bombay Beach lie, in order, the town of Westmoreland, whose name is attached to 2 of the zone's most consequential episodes, the 1981 magnitude 5.8 and the 2020 swarm that drew a federal forecast. Then the geothermal field with its wells and monitoring arrays, then the Salton Buttes and the seismically wired southern shore of the sea, and finally the fault terminus itself beneath Bombay Beach. That corridor is, kilometre for kilometre, one of the most heavily instrumented pieces of crust in the Western Hemisphere, precisely because it is the runway between the swarm factory and the Great Fault. A migrating swarm cannot cross it unobserved. Every step north would light up successive stations, and the analysts who watch this corridor professionally would see the walk in progress hours before any news outlet named it. When we lay out the watch checklist at the end of this video, migration up that corridor will sit at the top of it, and now you know the ground the checklist is watching, which raises the question this entire story balances on. What, exactly, is the condition of the engine? What do we actually know about the southern San Andreas, the fault that begins at Bombay Beach, and about how long it has been since it last moved? The answer is one of the most unnerving numbers in American geology, and it comes with a twist involving a vanished lake the size of a small state. Part 6. 300 Years of Silence. Dig a trench across the San Andreas Fault near the Salton Sea. Peel the sediment layers apart and you can read the fault's diary. Each past rupture leaves a signature, offset layers, cracked and refilled ground, buried scarps. And by dating the layers, paleoseismologists can reconstruct the calendar of great earthquakes going back 1,000 years and more. The definitive work on this stretch of the fault, published by Bell Philibosian, Thomas Fumal, and Ray Weldon in the Bulletin of the Seismological Society of America in 2011, reconstructed exactly that calendar for the Coachella section, the fault's southernmost reach, the part that begins at Bombay Beach. The calendar says the fault ruptured in large earthquakes repeatedly through the last millennium, at an average spacing of roughly 180 years. The calendar also says the most recent of those ruptures happened around the beginning of the 1700s. The commonly cited window centres on roughly the year 1726, and no major earthquake has broken the southernmost San Andreas since. Do the arithmetic and it lands hard. 300 years of silence on a fault whose own diary says it speaks, on average, every 180. The southern San Andreas is not merely due. By its own recorded rhythm it is well past due, further past due than any other section of the fault, anywhere in California. Regular viewers have heard the deeper version of this. Last week, in our video on the Mexico earthquake and what it meant for the West Coast, we walked through a study published this year in the Journal of Geophysical Research by Luca Burkhardt and colleagues at the University of Bern, working with the United States Geological Survey, modelling that concluded the San Andreas and San Jacinto faults are carrying more accumulated stress right now than at any point in roughly the last 1,000 years, and that the Cajun Pass area could host a joint rupture of both faults in the magnitude 7.4 to 7.8 range. We called the southern San Andreas the end of the book then, and nothing about tonight changes the metaphor. 3 centuries of plate motion, at roughly the rate your fingernails grow, has been deposited into this fault and not withdrawn. The strain is several meters of unspent slip, an earthquake's worth of motion, sitting in the account waiting for the withdrawal. But why has the withdrawal not come? Why would a fault with a 180-year habit skip a century and a half of appointments? For most of the modern era, the honest answer was simply, we don't know. Faults are irregular, averages deceive, be patient. Then, in 2023, a study in the journal Nature offered something better than a shrug, and it involves a body of water most people have never heard of. For thousands of years, the basin that now holds the Salton Sea periodically filled with an enormous freshwater lake, Lake Cahuilla, fed by the Colorado River when its delta wandered west. At its high stands, Cahuilla was a true inland sea, drowning the valley floor under 100 meters of water, its shoreline still visible today as bathtub rings on the desert mountains. And here is the finding. When researchers led by Riley Hill lined up the Paleoseismic calendar of southern San Andreas ruptures against the geologic record of the lake's fillings, the great earthquakes clustered around the times when the lake was full or filling. The mechanism is elegant and well within known physics. 100 meters of water is an enormous weight, flexing the crust, and its pressure seeps down into the fault zone as pore pressure, unclamping the fault, greasing it, at precisely the moments the lake stood high. The lake, in effect, may have been the fault's alarm clock. The Colorado River was dammed and diverted in the 20th century. Lake Cahuilla will not fill again. The modern Salton Sea, an accidental irrigation spill from 1905 now shrinking year by year, is a puddle standing in the footprint of the thing that may once have set the fault's schedule. If the Cahuilla hypothesis is right, the alarm clock has been unplugged, and part of the 300-year silence is explained. The fault lost its trigger, not its load. Read that carefully, because it is not good news wearing a lab coat. The strain accumulates regardless. The lake never created the earthquakes, it only timed them. A fault that has lost its scheduler does not stop failing. It fails on an unknown schedule later, larger, with the trigger to be named at a date of the crust's choosing. The trenching method behind that calendar deserves a brief look, because the confidence of the 300-year figure rests on it. At sites along the Coachella section, researchers cut trenches across the fault, excavations a few meters deep, walls scraped clean and gridded, and read the layered sediments the way you would read tree rings. An earthquake that breaks the surface leaves unambiguous marks, layers offset against each other across the fault plane, fissures that opened and filled with younger material, sand vented up from below by liquefaction during the shaking. Each of those marks is then bracketed in time by dating the layers above and below it, mostly through radiocarbon on buried organic matter, charcoal, plant fragments, shells from the lake we're about to discuss. Do this patiently, at multiple sites, cross-checking event by event, and you assemble the rupture history that Philibosian and colleagues published, at least half a dozen great earthquakes on this section over the past millennium, the intervals between them ranging widely around that 180-year average, and then, after the early 1700s, nothing. The record is not a model or an extrapolation. It is physical evidence, read from the ground, that this fault ruptures repeatedly, and has not done so in the lifetime of the United States. To make the stakes concrete, it helps to recall what the emergency planning community believes a southern San Andreas rupture would actually do. Numbers regular viewers have heard from us before in our video from June 10th on the 1,000-year stress study. The standard planning scenario, developed by the Geological Survey and Exercise statewide, models a magnitude 7.8 rupture of the southern fault, roughly 1,800 deaths, some 50,000 injuries, on the order of $200 billion in losses, and more than 20 million people close enough to feel it as the defining event of their lives. Shaking strong enough to damage buildings would last well over a minute in the Coachella Valley and the Inland Empire. Aqueducts, interstates, rail lines, and power corridors that cross the fault, and nearly everything connecting Los Angeles to the east does cross it, would be severed. That is the scenario whose ignition point sits 60 kilometers north of tonight's swarm, and whose fuse, the accumulated strain, has been documented by the trenches, the geodetic networks, and the stress modelling alike. When the odds move on this fault, they are odds on that event. It is why 1 in 100, a number that sounds almost dismissible in any other context, was enough to mobilize the state of California for a week. We will watch them do it in the next part. For contrast, it helps to remember that the San Andreas is not silent everywhere. Its personality changes dramatically along its length, and the southern silence is one temperament among several. In central California, between the locked sections, there is a stretch where the fault creeps. It slips continuously, a few centimeters a year, politely, in thousands of tiny events and slow silent motion, releasing its budget as it accrues and storing almost nothing. Towns there have curbs and culverts that bend gradually over decades, offset in slow motion, and the fault is famous among geologists precisely for being undramatic. Farther north, the section that ruptured in 1906 spent its stored 3+ meters on San Francisco in under a minute and has been rebuilding the account since. The 1857 rupture at Fort Tillon did the same for the central southern stretch, 169 years ago, a fact regular viewers will remember from last week's video. Each locked section keeps its own ledger. The Coachella section's ledger is simply the oldest unsettled one on the entire fault, the longest gap between withdrawals anywhere on the San Andreas system, which is why, whenever this fault system is discussed by the people who model it professionally, the conversation keeps arriving at the same place we have, the southern end, the quietest section, the fullest account, and the doorstep where, tonight, the ground happens to be trembling. The Cahuilla record adds one more detail that sharpens the unease rather than soothing it. When the researchers aligned the fault's rupture calendar against the lake's filling history, the correspondence was not loose. Nearly every one of the last several great ruptures on this section fell during or immediately after a period when the lake stood high. The one configuration conspicuously underrepresented in the record is the one we are living in, a long interval with no lake at all. The modern era is, in a real sense, off the chart, an experiment the fault has not run in its recorded history. Perhaps a dry basin fault simply waits longer and breaks the same way. Perhaps the missing water changes the failure mode in ways no one can model with confidence. The honest position, the one the study's framing supports, is that the southern San Andreas is currently operating outside the conditions under which its own historical rhythm was established, overdue by the old clock and unscheduled by any new one. Which brings us back to tonight with sharper eyes. At the foot of this overloaded, unscheduled 3 centuries silent fault, the crust has spent the night crackling. The one documented modern occasion when that arrangement, a swarm right at the terminus, actually materialized, the response of the United States Geological Survey was not to post reassurance. It was to publish odds. The week they did it is the single best guide we have to what happens if this swarm walks north, and it is where we go now. Part 7. The week the government published the odds. On September 26, 2016, the ground under Bombay Beach began to shake, not 60 kilometers from the San Andreas terminus, as tonight's swarm is, but essentially at it, in the fault's own front yard beneath the Salton Sea. Over the following days, the sequence produced roughly 100 earthquakes, ranging from magnitude 2 up to a maximum of magnitude 4.3. Numbers, you will notice, that are entirely comparable to what Brawley produced in May. 100 quakes here versus 300 there, a peak of 4.3 versus 4.7. As swarms go, 2016's was not even the biggest this zone had seen that decade. What made it different was the address. The swarm was so close to the southern San Andreas that the small stress changes from each event were landing directly on the fault's most sensitive section, the loaded, silent, past-due section we just spent a full part describing. And so the United States Geological Survey did something that, if you were not watching closely, might have slipped past you entirely. They ran the calculation. Publicly. They estimated how much the swarm had temporarily raised the probability of a magnitude 7 or greater earthquake on the southern San Andreas within the following 7 days. The background number first, because it is the ruler everything else is measured against. On any ordinary week with no swarm running, the chance of the southern San Andreas producing a magnitude 7 within that week is roughly 1 in 6,000. Small, not zero, never zero, on a fault carrying 300 years of strain, but small enough that no one reorganizes their life around it. During the swarm, the estimate moved. At its peak, the calculated odds of a magnitude 7 or greater within 7 days rose to somewhere between 1 in 300 and 1 in 100, with the more conservative end of the range near 1 in 3,000. Sit with the top of that range for a second. 1 in 100. The swarm had, by the government's own published arithmetic, multiplied the weekly odds of the most feared earthquake in America by a factor of as much as 60. The state of California did not treat that as an academic exercise. The Office of Emergency Services issued a formal earthquake advisory for the region, and for a week, emergency managers from the Salton Sea to Los Angeles were checking supplies and reviewing plans. Now, the ending, which you already know because you're watching this video in 2026, nothing happened. The swarm faded. The odds decayed back to their background 1 in 6,000 as the days passed without escalation. The advisory expired. The fault kept its silence, and the week entered the record not as a catastrophe, but as something arguably more valuable. A full dress rehearsal of the exact protocol that exists for moments like tonight. I want to be precise about what that week does and does not teach, because both lessons matter and they pull in opposite directions. The first lesson is the 1 in 100 number screams. Even at its worst, with 100 earthquakes popping directly at the terminus, the overwhelming probability, 99%, was that nothing would happen, and nothing did. Swarm-driven probability spikes are real, official, and still small in absolute terms. Anyone telling you a swarm means the big one is coming is wrong by, at minimum, a factor of 100. The second lesson is quieter. The protocol exists. Think about what that means. The United States Geological Survey does not maintain a published operational procedure for recalculating San Andreas rupture odds in response to, say, traffic vibrations, or distant earthquakes in Mexico, or the phase of the moon. They maintain it for exactly one phenomenon: swarms in the Brawley Seismic Zone and around the fault's southern terminus. The people with the best data on Earth about this fault system have decided, institutionally, that this specific situation, the one developing south of the Salton Sea right now, is the one worth keeping a live probability model for. Reassurance and vigilance folded into the same document. The system worked in 2016. It ran again in August of 2020, when a swarm near Westmoreland, the town between Brawley and the Salton Sea, notably north of where tonight's activity sits, prompted another formal forecast before that sequence too returned to normal levels. Twice in the last decade, swarms in this zone have been significant enough for the federal government to publish odds on the San Andreas. That is the club tonight's swarm is auditioning for. It is worth understanding, at least in outline, how a number like 1 in 100 gets made, because it is not a guess and it is not a formula scribbled in a crisis. The Geological Survey's swarm forecasts come from statistical models of earthquake clustering, models built on the same empirical laws we met earlier, Omori's decay among them, trained on California's century-long earthquake catalogue. The logic runs roughly so. Every earthquake, of any size, slightly raises the probability of further earthquakes nearby, including larger ones. Those probability contributions stack and decay over time in ways the catalogue constrains precisely. A swarm is, statistically, a dense cluster of probability contributions parked in one place, and when that place happens to adjoin a fault capable of magnitude 7.8, the model's output is the number everyone actually cares about, the chance that the cluster's influence tips the neighbour. Feed the 2016 Bombay Beach swarm into that machinery, at that location, and out came the range the agencies published, as high as 1 in 100 at the peak, decaying day by day as the swarm faded back toward the 1 in 6,000 background. The model does not know why the swarm is happening. It only knows what swarms at that address have historically meant. That humility is a feature. The forecast is an actuarial table, not a prophecy, and the agencies present it as exactly that. The choreography of that week is also worth recording, because it is the template for what would unfold if tonight's swarm forces a third performance. The Geological Survey issued its statement within about a day of the swarm's peak, publicly, on its own channels, with the odds stated plainly and the uncertainty stated plainly beside them. The State Office of Emergency Services translated the science into an advisory. Local governments from Imperial County to Los Angeles reviewed response plans, utilities checked shut-off procedures, schools ran drills, and residents were reminded, without sirens, without evacuation, without drama, to secure water heaters and know their meeting points. Then the week passed, the odds decayed on schedule, and the advisory expired as quietly as it had been issued. No panic, no false alarm recriminations, no cried wolf. It remains one of the better examples anywhere in the world of a government communicating live earthquake probability to the public and trusting them to hold two ideas at once, almost certainly nothing, and worth preparing anyway. Whatever else tonight's swarm becomes, it has already inherited that template, and the fact that the template exists, tested and shelf-ready, is one of the more genuinely reassuring facts this video has to offer. It is fair to ask why the response is probabilistic at all, why the agencies publish odds instead of answers, and the reason is one of the hardest won lessons in the history of the field. Seismology has tried prediction. For decades, at a bend of the San Andreas near the tiny town of Parkfield, The Geological Survey ran the most intensive earthquake prediction experiment ever mounted. The section had ruptured at roughly regular intervals through the historical record, a magnitude 6 about every 22 years, and in the 1980s the agency formally predicted the next one and instrumented the fault to saturation to catch it. The earthquake arrived, 16 years late in 2004, without a single precursory signal the network could identify. No warning strain, no telltale foreshocks, nothing. Parkfield taught the field, at the cost of considerable institutional humility, that even the best-behaved section of the best-studied fault on Earth does not announce itself. That lesson is why no serious agency anywhere now claims to predict earthquakes, and why the operational tools are all probabilistic. Aftershock forecasts, swarm forecasts, scenario planning, odds. The 1 in 100 of 2016 was not a hedge or a dodge. It was the field speaking in the only language its own history has licensed it to use. And when you hear that language deployed again, as you may in the coming days, you will know it is being used carefully by people who remember exactly why. The 2020 rerun deserves its own brief entry in the record, because it demonstrates the protocol's other setting, the calm one. That August, a swarm broke out near Westmoreland, inside the corridor we just described, north of tonight's activity, closer to the sea. The Geological Survey again published a formal forecast, walking the public through scenarios. Most likely the swarm fades, less likely it produces something in the magnitude 5 range, least likely but not 0, it climbs beyond. The peak reached magnitude 4.6. Within days, the agency issued the quiet follow-up that swarms usually earn. Activity had returned to normal levels, the forecast was allowed to lapse, and the episode closed without an advisory, without alarm, and largely without national attention. 2 runs of the same machinery, 4 years apart, with 2 appropriately different outputs. 2016's swarm at the fault's doorstep drew elevated odds and a state advisory. 2020's swarm, farther out, drew a measured forecast and a shrug. The system scales its response to the address, which tells you exactly how to read whatever it does in the coming days. If this restart stays put, expect at most a 2020-style forecast. If it walks north, the response will walk with it. So the machinery of official response is clear. If this swarm grows, and especially if it migrates north, there is a well-worn playbook, and you will see it executed in public. But that leaves the deeper question, the one the 2016 episode never had to answer. Why does this particular patch of California swarm at all? Why here, at the foot of the San Andreas, and essentially nowhere else on the fault's 800-mile length? The answer is stranger than almost anyone outside geology suspects. The Imperial Valley is not really California doing California things. It is the northernmost finger of an ocean being born. Part 8. The Rift Beneath the Farmland. Pull up a map of the Gulf of California, the long ribbon of sea separating Baja California from mainland Mexico, and follow it north. The Gulf exists because the crust there is being pulled apart. It is a young ocean basin, a rift, where Baja and everything west of the plate boundary is being levered away from the mainland a few centimeters per year, and seawater has flooded the widening gap. Rifts like this are floored by fresh volcanic rock, laced with hot springs and hydrothermal vents, and stitched together by exactly the kind of geometry we met earlier. Long strike-slip faults connected by short crosswise spreading segments, the big wheels and the small gears. Now keep following it north, past the head of the Gulf, across the border. The sea ends, but the rift does not. It continues underground, buried beneath the sediment the Colorado River has been dumping into this trough for millions of years, kilometers of silt and sand deep enough to bury a mountain range, which is in fact what it has done. The Imperial Valley is the drowned continuation of the Gulf of California, filled not with seawater, but with river mud, and farmed at the surface as if it were ordinary ground. It is not ordinary ground. Beneath Brawley, the continental crust has been stretched thin, dramatically thinner than the California average, and the deep rift processes that build new ocean floor in the Gulf are running right now, under the fields, in the dark. Almost everything strange about this valley snaps into focus the moment you see it as a buried rift. Why is the heat flow beneath the Salton Sea's southern shore among the highest measured anywhere in North America? Because the crust is thin and the mantle is close, exactly as in the Gulf. Why do volcanic domes, the Salton Buttes, poke up through the farmland at the sea's southeastern edge, because rifts make magma, and some of it has come all the way up, recently enough that the domes are geologically young. Why is the ground so saturated with hot brine that the region hosts one of the largest geothermal fields on the planet? Same answer. Thin crust, high heat, water everywhere the cracks go. And why does the Brawley Seismic Zone swarm? Because swarms are what hot, fluid-saturated, freshly cracked crust does. Recall the engine we described in Part 2. Fluids migrating through fracture networks, prying faults open, dropping the friction patch by patch. In cold, dry, thick crust, that engine has no fuel, which is why most of the San Andreas system, for all its danger, does not swarm. It locks, loads, and ruptures on the grand scale instead. But here, in the rift, the crust is a boiler room. Brines circulate through the fracture networks under pressure. Heat drives convection. The crosswise faults, the small gears, sit bathed in exactly the pressurized fluid that swarm mechanics requires. The Brawley Seismic Zone is prime swarm territory, for the same reason the Gulf of California is prime rift territory. It is the same place, wearing a disguise of lettuce fields. This is the final piece of the picture, and notice what it does to the story we have been building. The swarm's leaderless rhythm, its stop-and-restart habit, its crosswise fault, its 11-week intermission. Every oddity we have catalogued is explained by one fact of deep geography. This is rift crust, plumbed with hot fluid, behaving exactly as rift crust behaves. Nothing about tonight requires anything exotic, and yet the same fact is what makes the arrangement so remarkable, because plate tectonics has chosen to run this boiler room directly against the terminus of the most loaded fault in America. The place where the crust is most persuadable sits at the foot of the fault, most in need of only a little persuasion. That adjacency is permanent. It was here before Brawley existed, and it will be here after. The scale of the burial bears emphasizing, because it explains why none of this is visible, and why the valley's true nature went unrecognized for so long. The Colorado River has been pouring sediment into this trough for roughly 5 million years, the same eroded rock grain by grain that it was simultaneously excavating from the Grand Canyon. The fill is kilometers deep. Beneath Brawley, you would descend through several vertical kilometers of river silt, delta mud, and ancient lake bed before touching the stretched crystalline crust that is actually doing the tectonics. Everything we have discussed tonight, the crossfault, the hypercenters, the strong floor at 15 kilometers, is happening in and beneath that basement, under a lid of sediment thick enough to swallow the Sierra Nevadas foothills. The farmland at the surface is, in the most literal sense, a veneer, the Grand Canyon, redeposited as a lid over an opening ocean, and the rift's most photogenic evidence pokes right through that lid for anyone who knows where to look. At the southeastern shore of the Salton Sea stand the Salton Buttes, 5 low volcanic domes, unimpressive to drive past, geologically extraordinary. They are made of rhyolite lava that erupted through the full thickness of the sediment within roughly the last 2,000 years, which in volcanic bookkeeping makes them activeless material. Young enough that the magmatic system beneath them is presumed live, monitored accordingly, and occasionally discussed in the same cautious tone reserved for California's better-known volcanic fields. Magma, within the last couple of millennia, rose from the rift and reached daylight here, 60 kilometers from the San Andreas terminus, in the middle of the swarm zone's northern reaches. The buttes are the rift showing its hand at the surface, proof that what runs beneath the Imperial Valley is not merely a fault system, but the full apparatus of crustal creation, the same machinery that floors the Gulf of California, operating one thin lid of mud away from the lettuce fields. Seen from that height, the swarms recast themselves one more time. Around the world, the settings that produce persistent, restarting, fluid-driven earthquake swarms are overwhelmingly of exactly this type: rift zones, volcanic fields, geothermal provinces, the places where the crust is hot, cracked, and wet. Iceland's rift swarms for months at a stretch. The volcanic fields of the American West mutter in swarms for decades. The Brawley Seismic Zone belongs to that global family, and its behavior is family behavior. What no other member of the family has is the neighbor. Nowhere else on Earth does a rift's boiler room sit flush against the loaded terminus of a fault like the San Andreas. That adjacency is the singular fact of this geography. The thing that makes Brawley's ordinary rift behaviour into an extraordinary monitoring problem, and a night of magnitude 3s into 2 hours of your evening. If you want a sense of what the buried rift would look like without its lid, the Gulf of California supplies the uncensored version, and the comparison is instructive. At the Gulf's spreading segments, the seafloor is a volcanic terrain of fresh basalt, hydrothermal chimneys venting superheated mineral-rich water, and, this is the relevant part, near-constant earthquake swarms, recorded by ocean-bottom instruments whenever anyone deploys them. The swarming is simply what crustal creation sounds like, rock cracking as it stretches, fluids hammering through new fractures, small faults adjusting around injections of fresh material. Nobody monitoring a Gulf-spreading centre would find 17 small earthquakes in an hour worth a second look. It is the baseline hum of the machine. The Imperial Valley runs the same machine at reduced speed under its sediment lid, and by rift standards even the May swarm was modest output. It is only the address book, the loaded neighbour 60 kilometres north, that transforms routine rift noise into something Southern California has to take seriously. Same physics, different stakes, entirely because of what the noise sits next to. There is, however, one modern addition to the boiler room, something new in the last half-century, human and pumping. Because that geothermal field we keep mentioning is not a passive feature of the valley floor, it is an industrial operation, extracting hot brine from the swarm zone's own plumbing and injecting it back, at rates that have measurably changed how often this ground shakes. And that is where the conspiracy theories live, so let's go meet them properly. Part 9. The Power Plants and the Fault. Along the southeastern shore of the Salton Sea, the steam columns rise day and night. Roughly a dozen geothermal plants operate there, tapping the superheated brine of the rift to spin turbines. Clean power, drawn from the same heat that drives the swarms. The obvious question, the one that arrives in every comment section within minutes of a Brawley swarm making the news, is some version of, are the power plants doing this? And its darker sibling, could the power plants set off the San Andreas? Here is the part of the answer the conspiracy-minded get right, and it is important to give it to them straight because it is real, peer-reviewed, and published in one of the two most prestigious scientific journals on Earth. In 2013, Emily Brodsky and Leah Lajoie published a study in Science examining decades of seismicity in the Salton Sea geothermal field alongside the operational records of the plants, how much fluid was pumped out, how much injected back. They found a correlation. The background rate of earthquakes in the field tracks the net extraction rate. Pump more, shake more. Human operations at the Salton Sea measurably modulate the local earthquake rate. That is not a fringe claim. That is the published scientific literature, and any honest discussion of this valley has to start by conceding it. So the plants influence the shaking. The question that matters is scale, and this is where the theory, taken to its dramatic conclusion, falls apart against four separate walls. First, geography. Tonight's swarm, like May's, is sitting under and just south of Brawley, south of the geothermal field, on a structure the 2016 and 17 precursor swarm used a decade ago, kilometres from the injection wells. The correlation Brodsky and Lajoie found lives in the field itself. The structure swarming tonight is the wrong address for it. Second, history. This zone was swarming before any power plant existed, before the plants, before the accidental creation of the modern Salton Sea in 1905, and, per the Paleoseismic record, for as long as the rift has been here. The swarms are a feature of the geology. The plants, at most, turn a natural dial that was already installed. Third, magnitude. Nothing in the induced seismicity record here, or in comparable geothermal fields worldwide, produces the kind of event this question is really about. The documented effect is a modulation of small earthquake rates, magnitude 2s, 3s, occasionally 4s, in a zone whose natural swarm ceiling, as we're about to see, sits near 5.5 regardless. Fourth, distance. The southern San Andreas terminus is tens of kilometres from the injection wells, and the stress perturbations from fluid operations decay over distances of single kilometres. There is no documented mechanism, none, by which turbine operations at the Salton Sea reach out and unclamp a great fault 60 kilometres of crust away. But I want to leave this section honestly rather than tidily, because the tidy version, nature big, humans small, nothing to see, slightly misses what makes this valley uneasy. The Kauai study we covered 2 parts ago showed that water pressure at the surface, given enough of it, genuinely did time the great ruptures of the southern San Andreas for thousands of years. The Brodsky study showed that human fluid operations genuinely do move the needle on local seismicity today. Neither study connects the plants to the big fault. The scales are wrong by orders of magnitude, and no serious scientist draws that line. But together they establish something true and slightly vertiginous. This fault system is sensitive to water. It always has been. We removed the Great Lake that used to schedule it, and we installed pumps in its foyer, and the honest summary is that humanity has been adjusting the fluid environment of the most dangerous fault in America for a century without a full accounting of the consequences, probably harmlessly, almost certainly harmlessly, at the scales involved. Probably and almost certainly are doing real work in that sentence, and I would rather show you the work than hide it. The mechanics of the correlation Brodsky and Lejeune found are worth one more level of detail, because the study was genuinely clever, and its result more specific than the plants cause earthquakes. Geothermal operation at the Salton Sea is a loop. Hot brine comes up production wells, surrenders its heat to the turbines, and is pumped back down injection wells to sustain the reservoir. Neither half of the loop is seismically innocent. Extraction depressurizes and compacts the reservoir rock. Injection repressurizes it, but the two effects partially offset. What the study found was that the seismicity tracked the net difference, the volume extracted minus the volume returned. When operations ran a deficit against the reservoir, background earthquake rates rose in step. It is about as clean a demonstration as exists anywhere that human plumbing decisions register in a fault system's behavior, and it slots into a national picture that grew unmistakable in the same decade, when wastewater injection in the mid-continent oil fields turned Oklahoma, briefly, into the earthquake capital of the lower 48, culminating in a magnitude 5.8 near Pawnee in 2016. Induced seismicity is not a theory. It is a documented feature of the modern American ground itself, and this valley hosts one of its best-studied natural laboratories. The valley is also about to host much more industry, which makes tonight's themes only more current. The same brine the plants tap for heat carries some of the richest lithium concentrations in North America, and the region has been rebranded by boosters as Lithium Valley, with plans to scale extraction dramatically over the coming decade to feed battery production. More wells, more circulation, more industrial fluid handling in the same swarm-prone stepover at the foot of the same silent fault. The scientific consensus we have laid out, natural swarms, modest induced modulation, no plausible pathway to the San Andreas, was built on the current scale of operations. It will need to keep being rebuilt as the scale changes, and the seismic networks around the Salton Sea are being watched by more parties, with more at stake than at any time in the field's history. None of that changes tonight's verdict on tonight's swarm. It does mean the question you are watching this video to answer will be asked again, by more people, for years to come, and that the monitoring infrastructure this part depends on is likely to sharpen rather than fade. For completeness, it is worth knowing that the regulatory system around these operations is not passive. Geothermal operators at the Salton Sea report injection and production volumes to state authorities. Seismic monitoring in the field has been progressively densified precisely because of the published extraction correlation and induced seismicity protocols. The traffic light systems developed after the mid-continent experience, where operations curtail when local seismicity exceeds thresholds, are now standard vocabulary in permitting discussions across the industry. None of this is offered as blanket reassurance. Regulation follows science with a lag, and the science here is still being written. But the picture some commentary paints of an industry shaking a fault system in the dark, unobserved, inverts the reality. The Salton Sea geothermal field is among the most seismically scrutinized industrial sites on the continent. Its relationship to the local earthquake rate is published in the open literature rather than buried in it, and every swarm in this zone, including tonight's, is dissected within days by university, federal and independent seismologists with full access to the waveforms. Whatever this swarm turns out to be, it will not be because nobody was watching. What we can say with confidence is this: tonight's swarm is behaving like a natural swarm, on a natural structure, in the most swarm-prone natural setting in California, and no dial a power company controls determines what it does next. What determines that is the question we have been circling for an hour. How big do these things get? This zone has a track record. a century of swarms, some of which grew teeth. It is time to read it, because the record contains both the ceiling that should reassure you and the 2 entries that explain why nobody who knows this valley ever fully relaxes. Part 10. How big does it get? In late August of 2012, the town of Brawley got the answer to tonight's question the hard way. A swarm ignited immediately north of where the current activity sits, on the neighbouring rung of the same ladder of cross faults, and at first it looked like every other swarm the valley had shrugged off for generations. Small events, no leader, irregular rhythm. Then it climbed. Within hours, the sequence produced not 1 but 2 earthquakes above magnitude 5, a magnitude 5.3 and a magnitude 5.5 close together in time, with hundreds of smaller events crowding around them. The shaking cracked walls and broke windows in Brawley, knocked mobile homes off their supports, forced the evacuation of buildings, and rattled the valley through a day and night of near-continuous motion. Nobody died. The damage was minor by the standards of California disasters. But the 2012 swarm rewrote the local rulebook because it demonstrated that the crowd with no leader can, occasionally, produce members strong enough to hurt the town above them. 2 events above magnitude 5 from a swarm. Remember the energy staircase. A magnitude 5.5 releases roughly 700 times the energy of last night's magnitude 3.6. That is the documented ceiling for swarm-type sequences in this zone, about 5.5, reached in 2012, approached by other sequences across the past century. And there is one more entry in the record book from 1981, when an earthquake near Westmoreland reached magnitude 5.8. That event was a more conventional main shock aftershock rupture rather than a true swarm, but it happened inside the same seismic zone, on the same tangle of structures, and it stands as the strongest thing this patch of crust has produced in the instrumental era. Call it the zone's personal best, achieved the conventional way, with the swarm ceiling half a magnitude below it. Now put the pieces on the table side by side, because this is the honest shape of the local risk. The risk from the swarm itself setting the San Andreas aside entirely. The current sequence has reached 3.6. May's reached 4.7. The swarm ceiling is about 5.5. The events most likely to climb are the deep ones, born at the strong floor of the fault where ruptures start at maximum stress. And both May's and last night's largest events came from those depths. A magnitude 5.5, if this restart were to reach the ceiling, would arrive with almost no warning beyond what you're watching right now, at a depth of perhaps 13 kilometers, directly beneath or beside a city of 29,000 people, whose older buildings already showed, in 2012, exactly how they respond to that kind of night. The probability of that outcome is low. Most swarms, the overwhelming majority here and everywhere, never approach their ceiling. May's 300 earthquakes topped out at 4.7 and faded. The 2016 precursor swarm on tonight's exact structure never even got that far. If you forced me to bet, I would bet this restart follows the family pattern. Days or weeks of stuttering activity, perhaps a spike into the 4s, then the lengthening silences and the quiet win. That is the base case, and I will say it as plainly on the way out of this video as I'm saying it now. But you now know enough to see why the base case is not the whole story. This zone has thrown magnitude 5s from a swarm within living memory. It is currently running its 3rd documented sequence on a structure that keeps reopening. Its biggest punches come from its strongest depths, and it is doing all of this inside the transfer zone of a fault system whose northern neighbour has been storing energy for 300 years. The local ceiling is a cracked wall in Brawley. The regional ceiling is a different object entirely, and the difference between those 2 ceilings is the entire reason this channel exists. The 2012 sequence rewards a closer look at its clock, because the speed of its escalation is the detail with the most bearing on tonight. The swarm announced itself in the morning with small events, 3s, low 4s, the register Brawley is hearing right now. The magnitude 5.3 arrived in the early afternoon. The 5.5, the largest, came roughly 2 hours later. From ordinary swarm to peak violence took less than a day, and the 2 biggest events were separated by about the length of a long lunch. If tonight's restart were to follow that script, the escalation would not unfold over a week of mounting tension with daily news coverage. It would unfold between one phone alert and the next. That is the operational meaning of a swarm ceiling near 5.5. Not that the zone can eventually someday work its way up to it. but that it has previously covered the entire distance from where we are now to the ceiling in a single afternoon. The ground itself amplified what those magnitudes delivered, and this too is permanent context for the valley. The Imperial Valley's surface is young lake sediment and river fill, soft, water-saturated, unconsolidated, and soft ground is a shaking amplifier. Seismic waves slow as they enter it, and slowing waves grow taller, concentrating their energy near the surface exactly where buildings live. The same magnitude that would read as a sharp jolt on bedrock reads as a rolling extended furniture-walking event on valley fill. In 2012, that amplification, working on a 5.5 cracked walls, toppled merchandise, damaged older commercial buildings downtown, and knocked mobile homes from their piers, a housing detail worth underlining, because manufactured homes are a substantial share of Imperial County's housing stock and are distinctively vulnerable to exactly this failure. None of it approached catastrophe. All of it, in a county that ranks among California's poorest, landed on communities with the least slack to absorb repair costs. When we say the swarm itself is the lesser hazard tonight, that is a statement about the regional hierarchy of threats, not a claim that the ceiling is painless. The people of Brawley know precisely what a 5.5 over their basement feels like. That knowledge, as much as any seismological subtlety, is what the phrase high alert means at street level. To translate those magnitudes into felt experience, the intensity scale is the right instrument. It measures not the earthquake's size but the shaking's local severity, and it is what actually determines whether a night ends with rattled nerves or repair bills. Last night's magnitude 3.6 produced intensities around level 4 of 12 near the epicenter. Hanging objects swing, windows rattle, sleepers wake, nothing breaks. May's 4.7 pushed parts of Brawley toward level 5 and 6. Items off shelves, a few cracked windows, general alarm. The 2012 5.5 drove the centre of town to level 7. Real damage begins there. Cracked plaster and masonry, toppled chimneys on older buildings, mobile homes off their supports, the outcomes the valley remembers, and the planning scenarios for the fault to the north contemplate sustained level 9 and above along the rupture corridor, a category of experience no living Californian south of the 1994 Northridge zone has felt. The staircase from last night to May to 2012 to the scenario is thus not an abstraction of energy ratios. It is a staircase of thresholds: wake, alarm, damage, disaster. And the swarm is currently 2 steps up from the bottom, with its own documented ceiling 1 step higher and the fault next door holding the top of the stairs. Before we assemble the final picture, though, there is a piece of last night's story we have deliberately left sitting to one side. The piece that, if you found this video through a social feed, might be the reason you are here at all. Because at 3:21 in the morning Pacific time, while the Brawley swarm was stuttering through its opening hours, the ground moved again. Not in California, 1,100 miles away, in the Texas Panhandle, and within hours the internet had connected the two. Part 11. The Night the Continent Twitched. Here is what happened in Texas, stated cleanly. At 10:21 Universal Time, 3:21 in the morning in California, 5:21 in Texas, a magnitude 5.0 earthquake struck the Texas Panhandle, centered about 38 kilometers south-southeast of the town of Spearman, at a shallow depth of 5.7 kilometers. It rattled a region of ranches and gas fields, drew a green impact flag from the Geological Survey, meaning minimal expected damage, and produced no reported injuries. A magnitude 5 in the Panhandle is genuinely uncommon. Texas is not California. Its interior sits far from any plate boundary, and a shallow 5 there is a legitimately interesting event, the kind of intraplate earthquake that, in that region, often draws scrutiny about the deep injection of oilfield wastewater, a practice that has been linked to seismicity across parts of Texas and Oklahoma over the past 2 decades. That question, what caused the Spearman earthquake, is real, open, and worth its own investigation. But that is not the claim that went viral. The claim that went viral within hours was simultaneity, that the Texas earthquake and the Brawley swarm began at the same time, and that this synchrony reveals a connection, a continental pulse, a shared trigger, something moving beneath North America on a scale the agencies will not discuss. It is a genuinely atmospheric idea, 2 distant patches of ground stirring in the same darkness. I understand completely why it spreads. It also dissolves on contact with a clock. The Brawley Swarm's opening event came at 14 minutes past midnight Pacific time. The Texas earthquake came at 3:21 Pacific. That is a gap of just over 3 hours. Same night if you like poetry. Nowhere near the same time if you're doing physics. And the physics is the harder wall. For one earthquake to influence another across 1,700 kilometers, there are only 2 known channels. Static stress transfer, the permanent reshaping of stress around a rupture, decays so steeply that for a magnitude 5 it is finished utterly within a few tens of kilometers. Dynamic triggering, the passing seismic waves of one quake jostling a distant fault into motion, is real and documented, but it is the province of great earthquakes, magnitude 7s and 8s, whose surface waves are still substantial oceans away, and even then it mostly nudges faults that were already critically loaded, and even then the triggered events follow the wave train's arrival. A magnitude 3.6 in California cannot reach Texas. A magnitude 5 in Texas cannot reach California. And neither event preceded the other in any pattern the wave physics would require. There is no mechanism, no timing, and no precedent. There is only coincidence. And coincidence, on this planet, is cheap. Earth produces roughly 150 earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater every week. This particular week logged 157. With that many dice rolling continuously, 2 notable American events in one overnight window is not a signal. It is a Tuesday. While we are clearing the table, one more debunk briefly, because it recurs every time the ground and the sky are mentioned in the same week. The sun did not do this either. Solar activity was geomagnetically quiet through the swarm's onset. The planetary disturbance index sat at 2 to 3. The storm scales read 0 across the board. Whatever you make of the fringe literature connecting solar storms to earthquakes, and the mainstream verdict is that no established mechanism exists at these scales, there was no solar storm to blame. The one night the theory needed fireworks, the sun was asleep. Notice what all 3 of these dismissals, the plants in Part 9, the Texas link, the sun, have in common. Each one tries to hand the swarm's strangeness to an outside author. Industry, a continental pulse, the sky. And each one fails for the same reason. The swarm does not need an author. Everything it is doing is native behavior for rift crust at the foot of a great fault, which is, if you think about it, the more unsettling conclusion, because it means there is no dial to turn down and no operator to blame. The machine runs on its own schedule. The machine was running last night, and the only outside author that has ever plausibly conducted this particular orchestra was a lake that no longer exists. The Texas event deserves its own honest paragraph beyond the debunk, because it is a legitimately interesting earthquake that will get its own scrutiny in the days ahead. A shallow magnitude 5 in the Panhandle is rare by any historical measure. This region's background seismicity was, for most of the 20th century, close to negligible. What changed across broad stretches of Texas and Oklahoma over the past 2 decades is the deep disposal of oilfield wastewater. Brines injected by the billions of barrels into formations whose pressure changes have demonstrably reactivated ancient long-dead faults. Texas now operates its own dedicated seismic network, TexNet, created by the legislature for precisely this reason, and its analysts will spend the coming weeks doing for Spearman what we have spent tonight doing for Brawley, mapping the sequence, measuring its depth and mechanism, and rendering a verdict on whether the earthquake was natural, induced, or that increasingly common American category, a natural fault, artificially awakened ahead of schedule. Whatever they conclude, note the irony in the viral framing. The theory reached for a mysterious continental connection between Texas and California, when the mundane truth is that both regions independently illustrate the same unmysterious principle we established 2 parts ago. Fluid pressure moves faults. In California, the fluid is natural brine in a rift. In Texas, it may prove to be disposal water in a basin. No pulse connects them. A shared physics does. As for the broader night of coincidences reading, the sense that the planet itself was restless on July 23rd, the numbers dispose of it more gently than you might expect. In the 7 days surrounding these events, Earth logged 157 earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater, a Kermadec cluster, an Alaska pair, a Ryukyu event, a mid-Atlantic ridge rupture, the usual global inventory. That figure is within a whisker of the long-term average. The week was, planetarily speaking, unremarkable. The sensation of global restlessness is a construction of attention. 2 American events reached American feeds on the same night, and the mind, pattern-hungry as ever, drew the line. It is the same instinct that makes constellations out of unrelated stars. The stars are real. The line is ours. One more pattern deserves naming before we leave the viral claims, because you will meet it again every time the ground moves anywhere twice in one news cycle: the cluster illusion. Human beings are spectacularly bad at intuiting what randomness looks like. Genuine randomness is lumpy. It produces streaks, gaps, and coincidences constantly, because perfectly even spacing is itself a pattern, and a vanishingly unlikely one. Scatter 157 earthquakes across a week at random, and some nights will inevitably hold 2 or 3 notable events while other nights hold none. A week without a single such overlap would actually be the statistical oddity. The feeds amplify the lumps. Quiet nights generate no posts. Coincident nights generate thousands, and the archive of our attention ends up curated into pure signal with the noise deleted. Seismologists deal with this professionally by testing every apparent cluster against the boring hypothesis first. Given the background rates, how often would chance alone produce this? For 2 American earthquakes 3 hours apart on one calendar night, the answer is routinely, several times a year, forever. The boring hypothesis wins, as it almost always does. The discipline of letting it win, of demanding the data beat boredom before believing a pattern, is most of what separates the analysis you have watched tonight from the screenshot that may have brought you here. So the field is clear of ghosts. What remains is the real ledger, the events this fault system has actually produced in the living memory of the valley on the faults that bracket tonight's swarm. Because while everyone watches the swarm and worries about the San Andreas, the structures that have repeatedly provably wrecked the Imperial Valley are neither of those things, and their record is the last piece of context you need before we assemble the closing picture. Part 12. The faults that actually did it. The Imperial Valley does not need hypotheticals to know what a destructive earthquake feels like. It has a century of receipts. In 1915, twin magnitude 6.2 earthquakes struck the valley an hour apart, an opening statement from a fault system that was just getting warmed up. In 1940, the Imperial Fault itself, the great structure whose northern tip dissolves into tonight's swarm zone, ruptured in a magnitude 6.9 that tore through El Centro, killed 9 people, wrecked irrigation infrastructure across the border region, and offset the international boundary fence by several meters, leaving a scar you can still trace today. In 1979, the same fault broke again at magnitude 6.5, damaging buildings across the valley in an event studied so thoroughly it became a foundational dataset for earthquake engineering. In 1987, the Superstition Hills fault to the west produced a magnitude 6.5, preceded, notably for tonight's themes, by a magnitude 6.0 foreshock on a crosswise structure, the valley's small gears once again announcing the big wheels. And in 2010, just across the border, the El Mayor Cucapa earthquake reached magnitude 7.2, the largest event in the region in a century, throwing damage from Mexicali to Calexico and proving the system's upper register is alive in the modern era. 5 destructive earthquakes in 100 years, every one of them on the strike-slip faults that bracket the Brawley Seismic Zone, the Imperial Fault to the south, the Superstition Hills and San Jacinto systems to the west, the El Mayor rupture continuing the family southward into Mexico. This is the proven hazard of this valley, not the swarm, which in a century of trying has never exceeded 5.5. Not yet the southern San Andreas, which has not spoken in the instrumental era at all. The events that actually filled the valley's hospitals came from the bracketing faults, arriving the conventional way, suddenly, without a swarm's courtesy of a warning, on structures everyone knew about and nobody could schedule. Hold that pattern against tonight, because it produces the evening's most practical insight. The swarm is, in a strange way, the most visible and least dangerous member of its own family. It announces itself for days. The bracketing faults announce themselves for seconds. And this is why every earthquake authority who has ever commented on a Brawley swarm lands on the same unglamorous advice. The swarm you can feel is the reason to prepare for the earthquake you cannot. The water, the plan, the strapped shelves, the shoes by the bed, the whole familiar checklist, pays off not against the magnitude 3s rattling the valley tonight, but against the 6.9 that arrives some ordinary afternoon with no swarm attached. A community that treats each swarm as a rehearsal comes out ahead of one that treats it as a false alarm, even though, precisely because, most swarms resolve into nothing. The 1940 earthquake deserves the fuller telling because it remains the event every risk model in this valley is ultimately calibrated against. It struck on the evening of May 18th, and its rupture ran along the Imperial Fault for tens of kilometres, breaking the surface through the farm grid and offsetting everything built across it: roads, rail lines, canal banks, and most famously the international border fence, which was wrenched sideways by several metres in an afternoon and photographed for every textbook since. 9 people died. The irrigation system that made the valley's agriculture possible was gravely damaged, with canal networks broken at dozens of crossings. An engineering history was made almost by accident. A strong motion instrument at El Centro captured the shaking in full, producing what became for decades the most famous accelerogram on Earth, the El Centro record, the waveform against which generations of buildings, dams and bridges worldwide were designed and tested. Engineers who have never heard of the Brawley Seismic Zone have spent careers with this valley's ground motion running through their software. The 1979 repeat, magnitude 6.5 on essentially the same fault, added the modern sequel. By then the valley had been instrumented with a dense accelerometer array precisely in anticipation, and the earthquake obligingly ruptured through the middle of it, delivering another of the foundational datasets of earthquake engineering. This unassuming farm valley has taught the world how ground shakes twice. For tonight's purposes, though, the most instructive entry is 1987, and it is worth spelling out the sequence plainly. On November 23rd of that year, a magnitude 6.0 earthquake struck on the Elmore Ranch Fault, a northeast trending cross fault, the same crosswise species as the structure swarming under Brawley right now. 11.5 hours later, the neighbouring Superstition Hills Fault, one of the big northwest trending blades, ruptured at magnitude 6.5. The cross-fault event had unclamped its larger neighbour, and the larger neighbour went within half a day. That is the documented local this valley precedent for a small gear triggering a big wheel, the real version of the interaction everyone fears between tonight's swarm and the San Andreas. The distances involved in 1987 were a few kilometres, not 60. The triggered fault was mid-sized, not a 3-century loaded giant, and no Brawley swarm has ever repeated the trick. The precedent does not predict. But it establishes, in this valley's own catalogue, that the family of faults now active can, at sufficiently close range, wake its neighbours, and that fact, more than any distant theory, is the sober kernel inside the valley's alertness tonight. The 2010 El Mayor Cucapa event closes the historical ledger with a detail almost tailored to tonight's themes. The earthquake struck on Easter Sunday afternoon, magnitude 7.2, rupturing about 120 kilometres of faulting through Baja California just south of the border, the region's largest event in decades. Its direct damage fell mostly on Mexicali and, on the American side, Calexico. But its most scientifically fascinating effect was remote. In the hours and days afterward, instruments recorded triggered slip and bursts of small earthquakes on faults throughout the Imperial Valley, including surface creep on the Imperial and Superstition Hills faults, and a notable uptick of activity in the Brawley Seismic Zone itself, tens of kilometres from the rupture. A great earthquake to the south had reached into this valley and audibly turned its gears. The asymmetry with tonight is the lesson. Magnitude 7.2s influence the neighbourhood at range. Magnitude 3.6s do not. Influence in this fault system flows downhill from the great events to the small structures, essentially never the reverse, which is exactly why the swarm's danger to the San Andreas is negligible at 60 kilometres, and exactly why the San Andreas, when it eventually goes, will be felt in every gear of this valley at once. There is one more reason the historical ledger matters tonight, and it points forward rather than back. Notice that in 1987, the big rupture was preceded by a substantial event on a crossfault, the same species of structure that is swarming right now. The valley's small gears and big wheels are not strangers. They load and trigger one another at close range in ways the record has repeatedly demonstrated. That is the documented local kilometre-scale version of the interaction everyone fears at the 60-kilometre scale with the San Andreas. Close up, it is real. At distance, it has never once happened here. The entire question of tonight, the question we are finally ready to answer, is which of those two precedents governs what comes next. Part 13. The Checklist and the Quiet. Let me give you the base case first, without hedging, because after 2 hours you have earned a plain sentence. This swarm will most likely fade. Days or weeks of stuttering activity, possibly a spike into the magnitude 4s as May produced, then lengthening silences, then quiet. The pattern of May, of 2020, of 2016, of nearly every swarm this zone has produced in a century of records. The odds that these 17 earthquakes are the opening notes of a San Andreas rupture are, on the 2016 government arithmetic performed for a swarm sitting far closer to the fault than this one, somewhere south of 1% even in the worst week. The people of Brawley are on alert and should be. They are not in the path of a known oncoming event, and nothing in this video says otherwise. But you did not watch 2 hours for the base case alone. You watched to know what would change it. So here is the checklist, concrete enough to use, the same one the professionals are running against this swarm right now. Watch the maximum magnitude. If this sequence climbs past May's 4.7 and toward the zone ceiling of 5.5, it has left the family pattern and entered the 2012 regime, where the swarm itself becomes a hazard to the town above it. Watch the location. If the epicenters begin walking north, past Westmoreland, toward the geothermal field and the shore of the Salton Sea, the swarm is migrating up the transfer zone toward Bombay Beach, and every kilometre northward shrinks the buffer that currently makes its influence on the San Andreas negligible. Watch the depth. If the biggest events keep coming from the 13 to 16 kilometre floor, the strong basement remains engaged, and the capacity for a larger rupture stays on the table. And above all, watch for the paperwork. If the United States Geological Survey publishes a swarm forecast, or the California Office of Emergency Services issues an advisory as it did in 2016, the professionals with the best data on Earth have concluded this sequence crossed their threshold. That is the signal that separates a noisy week from a notable one. Not a viral map, not a screenshot, not a feeling. The protocol. It has run twice in a decade. Watch for the third. And then there is the thing the checklist cannot capture, the thing this whole night is really about. 60 kilometres north of the swarm, the San Andreas Fault comes up out of the ground at Bombay Beach and holds 300 years of silence. Every fact we have assembled tonight arranges itself around that silence. The rift crust swarms constantly at the fault's foot, and the fault never answers. The lake that may once have set its schedule is gone, its bathtub rings fading on the mountainsides above a shrinking sea. The strain, 3 centuries of plate motion, several metres of unspent slip, sits in the account, earning interest, while the fault's own diary says the average gap between withdrawals is 180 years. The most persuadable ground in California trembles tonight at the doorstep of the fault most in need of only a little persuasion, and the fault does what it has done for 300 years, through every swarm, every advisory, every restless night in the valley. Nothing. Perhaps that is the real reason a pile of magnitude 3s can put a valley on high alert. Not because anyone believes tonight is the night. The numbers say it almost certainly is not. But because every swarm is a knock on a door that has to open eventually, and no one alive has ever heard what is on the other side. The crust keeps knocking. The fault keeps its silence. And somewhere between those two facts, the people of the Imperial Valley go about their lives on top of a rift dressed as farmland, checking their phones in the dark, listening. There is a version of this story we have deliberately not told tonight, and before the close, you should know it exists and why we passed on it. It is the countdown version, the one where the swarm is a fuse, the fault is a bomb, and the video ends with a date. Channels tell it because it works. Fear is the cheapest fuel in this genre. The trouble is that every element of it is false to the science. The swarm is not a fuse. 99 times and more out of 100, on the government's own arithmetic, sequences like this one resolve into silence. The fault is not a bomb on a timer. It is a slow account, overdrawn by every average we can compute, whose settlement date no method on Earth can name. Not the trenches, not the satellites, not the stress models, not the swarm statistics. Anyone who gives you a date is selling something. What the honest version offers instead is, I would argue, stranger and better. A window, open right now, onto the exact mechanism by which the most consequential earthquake in American history will eventually begin. Not a prophecy, a vantage point. Very few generations get to watch the loading of a great fault in real time, with instruments, with published odds, with the record deep enough to know what they are seeing. You are in one of them. The alert level in the Imperial Valley tonight is not fear of a date. It is the posture of people who understand their address, and that posture, multiplied across a state, is worth more than any prediction ever could be. Since the checklist is practical, let the preparation be practical too, stated once and briefly, because it is the part of tonight anyone can actually act on. The advice that follows every Salton area swarm is the same advice that held in 2016. Water for several days, a household meeting plan, heavy furniture and water heaters strapped, shoes and a flashlight reachable from the bed, and the early warning app on your phone if you live anywhere in Southern California. It will do nothing for the swarm's small events, and it may buy you the critical seconds when the larger neighbour finally speaks. None of this is dramatic. All of it is the entire practical difference, multiplied across millions of households, between the planning scenario's casualty figures and something smaller. The Imperial Valley's own century of earthquakes has proven repeatedly that the preparation done in calm weeks is the only kind that exists when the shaking starts. No one has ever strapped a water heater during an earthquake. And the walkout question has one more layer for regular viewers, because tonight slots into a pattern this channel has been tracking all summer without quite naming it. In the past 10 days alone, tremor counts rising quietly along the locked fault to the north of California, an earthquake off Vancouver Island probing the torn edge of a subducting plate, the Mexico megathrust and its misbehaving aftershocks testing the stress maps of the west coast, and now the rift at the San Andreas' foot, clearing its throat for the second time in a season. None of these events caused any other. We have spent half the summer demonstrating precisely that the mechanisms do not connect at these distances, but all of them are the same picture photographed from different angles, a plate boundary carrying centuries of stored motion, expressing its load through every seam that can still speak, while the seams that matter most stay silent. The silent ones, Cascadia, the southern San Andreas, are the story of this era of the American West, and the noisy ones are how the era lets us watch it. Tonight the watching post is a farm city below sea level, on a rift dressed as farmland, where the phones will keep lighting up in the dark whether or not the answer comes this week. So here is the question to carry out of tonight, the one with an answer coming whether we like it or not. In the days ahead, does this swarm fade back into the 11-week silence it came from? Or does it climb past 4.7, walk north past Westmoreland, and force the Geological Survey to publish, for the third time in a decade, the odds on the most dangerous fault in America? The seismometers south of the Salton Sea are answering that question right now, one small earthquake at a time. We will be watching them tomorrow night.